All right. I'm so glad to be welcoming Branko Marcetic back to Bad Faith podcast. He was on, maybe just a few weeks ago. But your foreign policy analysis is always welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm glad to be here discussing another very cheery topic with you.
And of course, that's sarcasm, but we'll make it fun. We'll figure out a way. Also joining us for the first time on Bad Faith podcast, Andrew Fishman, who I have just learned is now president of Intercept Brazil. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so what I want to talk to you about is Brazil, recent political events in Brazil. We had a guest on Rising recently who I hoped to shed some light on some stuff, but it became very clear that he wasn't as knowledgeable, shall we say, as I would have liked. And I was racking my brain about who to talk to fill in the gaps. We also just did an episode earlier this week with Glenn Greenwald, who I know people have been criticizing about some of his Brazil coverage of late with respect to some speech laws. And I just wanted to have a better understanding of where these takes were coming from, what the criticisms were grounded in, what actually is happening from people who are a little bit closer to the issue. So I want to start with you, Andrew, because so much of the gist of the coverage in the United States of Brazil's 1/6, as one might call it, is exactly through that lens, to make these comparisons between what happened in the United States in January of 2021 and what happened in Brazil a few weeks ago. I want to hear what your thoughts are about the legitimacy of those comparisons and what meaningful differences exist.
Yeah, I mean, on the ground, they're similar because you had a bunch of supporters of a right-wing president who were storming the Capitol, protesting the election results and claiming that they were false. But in reality, they're actually very, very different events because in Brazil, you had this whole apparatus that's basically backed by the military that's been behind the scenes of the whole Bolsonaro era, the whole Bolsonaro presidency, and definitely behind this invasion in the Capitol. And they deny it in public, but you saw that the protesters were based in they were camped out in front of the military headquarters. They got a police escort, and the police are militarized in Brazil, down to the scene of the crime. And then later on, when the federal government came in to intervene and tried to arrest all these protesters at the encampment, it's been reported that the military blocked them twice. And the reason why they blocked them is because they had their friends and family in amongst themselves, and they gave their family members enough time to escape so that they wouldn't be arrested and face their own problems, but also cause that sort of scandal. It's been very clear that this is something much bigger than just a bunch of crazy people who believe in conspiracy theories and QAnon shamans, the Brazilian version, just being upset and breaking stuff. This is a more serious and has much more political buy-in, especially from the Brazilian military, which is basically like the Brazilian deep state. That's what they've made of themselves in the last 10, 15 years.
That's so interesting because so much of the Western coverage that I saw actually made the opposite point. It said, it lauded Brazilian authorities for making more arrests in the short term than had been done in the United States. There was, criticism of U.S. federal troops not being deployed with more alacrity as compared to what happened in Brazil. And there was an emphasis on the fact that there was this longer term plot in the United States to submit these fake slates of electors that were going to be counted on 1/6, and that there was this connection between the riot and the plan to actually more substantively overturn the election as compared to Brazil. So what do you make, if anything, of how that slant is coming out in the United States?
Well, Brazil's just so incredibly complicated that it's that narrative makes sense, but it's also not fully true. Because you don't have like Republicans and Democrats, two parties. One party takes over and the other ones are out of power. You have, and you don't have like the bad guys and the worst guys. Here, the bad guys are always in power. It's the Centrão, like the oligarch politicians that are in control. And they're on Lula's team now. They were Bolsonaro's best allies before. They play all sides. They're always in power and they're always going to be in control. And as soon as Lula won, they jumped ship and moved over to Lula away from Bolsonaro. But for the coup against Dilma, they were on board with that because they saw which ways the winds were blowing. And you have the military, but the military police are slightly different. And what happened on January 8th was the military came in and asked for martial law. So that basically they would be able to take over control of Brasilia and put things down. And Lula said no, because he realized the risk that was going on and the role that the military was playing in this. He did a federal intervention where the civilian control of the federal government took over Brasilia, and they didn't let the military take over. And then he ordered the federal police, which are now under his control, and he kicked out the leaders that were all Bolsonarista to reinstate order. And then the state police from Brasilia came in and also helped restore order. But the governor and his security secretary were clearly involved, and the security secretary has been arrested, and the governor's probably going to get impeached or could get impeached over this. They seem to be involved in this, at least conniving with allowing it to happen. But then once they saw which way the winds were blowing, they quickly said, "Oh no, we had nothing to do with this. We're so sorry. This was a mistake. This is the federal government's fault, actually." And then did the minimum. So there's a lot of this shadow games happening here, and people switching sides. So it's, for an outside observer, it's really complicated. For an inside observer, it's incredibly complicated. And there's still so much that we don't know.
Well, I mean, Branko, you recently wrote a piece for Jacobin called "A Year After the Capitol Riot, Nothing Useful Has Been Done," in which you interrogate the kind of public response, the national response to 1/6. It's interesting to hear Andrew say, it's not left to right like in the United States. It's this kind of, I forget the words used, but corporate-backed power that has persisted throughout. And there's not necessarily a default to one once the other loses. But one might argue, and many leftists in the United States do argue, that that's exactly what we have. And the two-party system is this kind of veneer. And you critique the fact that the response from both Democrats and Republicans in the United States to 1/6 has been to ramp up the security state almost exclusively, as opposed to pursuing other avenues. Can you talk a little bit about what your critique was in that piece?
Yeah, I mean, I thought the response to January 6th in the US was, let's say misguided at best, self-defeating at worst. I think it was it focused on the wrong things. It focused on all the low-level, protesters and so on and so forth, the rioters who went and stormed into the Capitol, and some of them did vandalism, some of them just walked around and took selfies and didn't really do anything. That was where the majority of the ire from the press and the public was kind of aimed at. To me, the most outrageous thing and the most alarming thing, number one, you had similar to Brazilian high-level officials, of course, Trump being at the head of it, who were spreading these lies and who were kind of egging on these people who were really just brainwashed and deluded, who seemed to genuinely believe that Trump really had won and that Democrats had stolen the election. But it was really the high-level people that I think you had to go after, because they were the ones at the head of it. And it's not just people, officials like Trump that were kind of spreading this lie, but also, you look at the news media structure in the United States was obviously heavily corporatized, and that allowed this proliferation of all sorts of misinformation. That's the word in vogue these days. Propaganda that told people, that fed people these lies about the election. I think that could have been another target to go after, not in a censorious way, but I think just by basically taking on the deregulated corporatized structure of the news media. I think that would have been a useful thing to do. You might also look at the corporate donors that gave to the Republican officials who denied the election results and similarly poured gasoline onto the flames of election misinformation. And by the way, who have gone back to, after promising that they wouldn't donate to them again after that whole scandal, have gone back to doing it quietly with very little outrage. And I think the other thing that was particularly alarming to me, and that I think has been the most shameful for not having been really touched at all by people in Congress ultimately, was the role of the security agencies and law enforcement. I mean, it's a similar to Brazil. It's a profoundly weird episode. How is it that these protesters were met with such a tiny show of security, when anyone who who's ever been to a protest in Washington, D.C., big or small, knows that there's always copious amounts of manpower at the ready to prevent people from, crossing over into the Capitol or going into God knows where. That has never been adequately explained. Neither has just the copious amount of information that we've gotten over the last year about how much forewarning U.S. officials actually had, or rather law enforcement had, about the fact that people were planning to storm in, about the fact that some people were even threatening violence, about all sorts of things.
I mean, didn't we know though? I mean, I remember being here in DC and being warned like not to go outside. During that whole period of time, I remember coming back from the holidays and knowing that there was a plan. I mean, there was reporting about information that was circulating around in various social media apps, and it wasn't clear that it was going to obviously be what it was in terms of people forcing their way into the Capitol and someone being killed and all of that. But it's certainly the idea that there was going to be a protest that was not insignificant in size was definitely around enough that you would expect there to be at least an average security response, if not an above average security response, right?
Yeah, I mean, you did not need a colossal surveillance state to figure out that there was going to be some sort of protest of some significant size on that day in DC. Like you said, it was known, it was openly talked about. And there have been several reports kind of looking at some of the law enforcement failures, and they talk about the fact that they were undermanned, they were under-resourced, their riot shields, for instance, were faulty, or they didn't have enough of them, that kind of thing. We've gotten since then so many other reports of people, who work for the Secret Service or other agencies who are kind of, ringing the alarm, flashing the big red light just before this was happening, saying, hey, we need to do something about this. And they were just ignored. And, whether that was willful or just incompetence, it's hard to say. I think there clearly is. I think there has been evidence that there's at least some sympathy for the Capitol rioters and what they believed within law enforcement. But even if it's just incompetence, I think that's still pretty bad. I mean, how much money is thrown at security and surveillance yearly in the United States, and apparently it doesn't do anything.
Yeah, and to your point in your article, the response to all of this has been to throw more money at it. All of the progressives and squad members were pretty roundly criticized by the left for voting for increased funding to Capitol security, but it's not entirely clear that their failures were a consequence of not having enough money in the first instance. But another interesting thing that this raises for me is how it is that so many mainstream elite politicians and media figures on the right really did create conditions where, I think to your point, Branko, regular folks, people whose ideology I don't agree with, whose politics I don't subscribe to, but regular people, I think, were misled by people who were better in the know, who had power and authority, into thinking that they were really doing something on 1/6. And this is, I think, I don't know if you guys have seen that Andrew Callahan documentary on HBO about 1/6, but it was something that really came through in that documentary, the extent to which people really thought that they were not going to face legal penalty because people who are legislators were misleading them as to what was actually happening and the legitimacy of their claims. And part of what laid the foundation for people feeling like they had a legitimate claim on the American side of it was that they had been saying for weeks and months that the only way that Trump could lose the election was through election fraud. And there was a lot of misinformation around that led people to believe that that was legitimately the case and that they were on the right side of history. And in Brazil, I saw, Andrew, that you had written an article over the summer about how Lula's lead was collapsing, that he had been 18 points ahead. And I wonder what the portrait was on the Brazil side in terms of people's expectations for the outcome of the election being so close, and how the kind of information ecosystem informed the uprising, or what are you guys calling it in Brazil?
They're calling it a terrorist attack, which I know doesn't ring very well into U.S. ears, but it was actually pretty strong that the Brazilian media quickly came out and labeled it, so strongly and didn't waffle at all.
That's so fascinating. Because the politics of even saying like insurrection in the United States, even if you very much disapprove of the substantive politics of the people involved, there are significant parts of the left where if you say it was an insurrection, it seems like overly credulous and liberal to believe that they could have actually changed the outcome of the election or something. And it's perceived as, fear mongering and hand wringing and I don't know, big lib energy stuff, Well,
Yeah.
I mean, help me understand like the differences between how events in Brazil are being filtered differently by the media or covered differently, I should say.
Yeah, the first question about the election, it was amazing to see. If you ask people what they thought the election results were going to be, it was completely skewed by their media circle. I mean, people that were Bolsonaristas were absolutely convinced that he was going to win the first round. People who were totally in the liberal Lula media sphere were absolutely convinced that Lula was going to win in the first round. Maybe he would make the second round, and so they were both really shocked when the Bolsonaristas in Congress just did really, really well. And Lula did much better. It was like 8 million votes ahead, but he didn't win the first round. The Bolsonaristas have been saying for years that there's going to be election fraud. There's going to be election fraud the whole time. And the media and the courts were trying to stifle that. And then in the end, there was actually a lot of election fraud, but Bolsonaro did it. There's all these schemes that came out of vote buying, which I'm sure we only scratched the surface of how much vote buying they did in the interior, and lies about how people were going to lose their welfare checks if they didn't vote for Bolsonaro, and it was going to be cross-referenced, or and lots of other types of fake news, but also the pressure from local mayors and authorities to try to get people to go Bolsonaro, and then they also used the federal highway police to try to intimidate voters in pro-Lula areas. So there was a ton of election fraud, which is one of the reasons why Bolsonaro is probably in Miami right now, or in Orlando, because he knows how many crimes that he's committed, especially in the last few months. The media has been extremely anti-Bolsonaro, the mainstream media, but then there's this whole Bolsonaro ecosystem, including some of the mainstream media outlets, decided to hitch their wagon on the Bolsonaro train, and they, a lot of them have been basically doing mass layoffs, mass deletion of posts, of videos on their YouTube accounts, and trying to rebrand now that it's a new era, and everyone's trying to distance themselves from January 8th, including a lot of the supporters in Congress who totally backed it and were cheering it along the way. They're afraid of getting their accounts blocked by a judge, and they're afraid of the legal consequences of this, because the big difference between Brazil and the U.S. is that Brazil had a military coup in 1964. It was they called it a civil military coup because it was between the business elite and the media and the military, which ended in 1984. It's very recent. I mean, a lot of people that are alive right now, adults, everyone that's in government, they were all alive and were born under a military dictatorship. And so there's a lot more fear of that sort of thing coming back. So I know that it's possible. And that's why they've been calling it terrorism, because, I'm trying to think of the word in English, pushing for a coup, demanding a coup, agitating for a coup is illegal. It's a crime in and of itself, because, and that was written into the Constitution, the 88 Constitution, because of the recent history of this military coup. And the people that were out there on January 8th really believed that they were going to get that. That's really what they want. They want the military to take over and overturn and have the military hand power back to Bolsonaro. And so it seems much more plausible here than it does to the average American, where it's just unthinkable that something like that would happen in the U.S. quite so easily.
Yeah, it did. 1-6 felt like a dog catches car situation, where a bunch of people who were kind of pantomiming a coup were like, "Oh shit, we got inside," and now we're gonna walk between the guided tour ropes because we don't actually know what we're supposed to do once we got in here. But you're saying that, I've heard people argue that in Brazil, though, it was a day where nobody was in the government buildings. It was
Sunday.
empty. It wasn't the kind of American plot where there was this activity happening inside the validation of these slates of electors, which if stopped technically would put a technocratic stop to electing Joe Biden. But none of that was happening in Brazil. So you're saying that the people on the ground thought that they were going to be able to effectuate a coup, but how? What was the mechanism?
I mean, it's a good question. There's not a clear answer right now because, yeah, like, how are you going to overthrow a government by storming the government offices on a Sunday?
Right.
When nobody's there. The president's not even in Brasilia. He's in another state. Like, what's your step two, right? Step one, invade. Step two, question mark. Step three, coup. And the answer is probably that they believed that the military was going to take action. Just like when the military offered Lula to do a state of martial law, like who knows what could have actually happened if that were to have happened. And the Lula government was very wise not to accept that offer. There's other questions too, like why did they wait to do it until Lula was already inaugurated? January 6th, Trump was the president. Why would you wait until you have the opposition in control of a lot of the levers of power, which they wouldn't have been in control of previously? And there was, we discovered because of this, the security secretary for Brasilia was Bolsonaro's justice minister. And so he, left office, the transition of powers on New Year's. So January 1st inauguration, all the old Brasilia security establishment is in charge and they make sure that everything goes well. And it was a very successful event. January 2, he comes into power. He fires everybody in the command of the security infrastructure of Brasilia, which is also, over $1 billion a year in investments, a huge apparatus. And then he, on the same day, flies to Orlando. The day before, on the 7th, he meets with Bolsonaro in Orlando. And then, so he basically chopped off the head of the security establishment and fled and was clearly colluding. And then the other piece of the puzzle with the security issue is the presidential guard that should have been guarding the presidential palace that was stormed is run by the military, by the army. And there's 1,000-man deployment in Brasilia, and they clearly knew that this was happening. This was being planned on social media for days, and the military controls all of the intelligence apparatus too, so they knew what was going on. They didn't deploy. They weren't there. They chose not to. Which is another piece of evidence that maybe there was some bigger forces behind this that were colluding, which is maybe part of the reason why they thought that this could work on a Sunday. I also saw that some of them thought that they were going to move their encampment from the military headquarters basically to the center of power and basically set up shop there and not leave and just do like an occupation, which also seems pretty unrealistic that would be allowed to occur unless you had the military basically protecting you.
Yeah, the fact of Lula needing to have the insight not to say yes to this federal military intervention because it could be a Judas knife in his back makes the situation that superficially seems less exigent than what happened in the United States much scarier seeming. It's a little confused. I'm still, I guess, trying to wrap my brain around what the valence of it was, and if it was that serious, and if there is that kind of lack of control or kind of a historical norm of compliance with the outcomes of elections, the likes of which we have here, despite 1/6. I mean, I don't think there was anybody who thought the military was going to rise up and side with Trump or anything like that. Is it actually over? I mean, people might have expected a protest in Brazil to have happened on or before New Year's, before Lula was sworn in. It didn't. It
was
happened
actually planned,
after.
But it didn't happen. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
It was planned before, but they couldn't get their shit together in time, so it got pushed back.
And yet it happened anyway at a point at which some people would say it was too late. So now, even though time moves on, are there ongoing concerns about people trying something like this again?
Absolutely. And that's, I posted on Twitter a few days after saying that, like, the coup was defeated, but the coup is still ongoing because you have these Bolsonaro supporters in the government that are still in positions of power. And then you also have, the military apparatus has been completely untouched. And it seems quite clear that a lot of leading military voices were involved in this, at least knew about it, were probably supporting it. I mean, one of the most prominent military leaders, his wife was visiting the encampments and pointing to the back of her truck, which had tinted windows, kind of indicating that maybe her husband was in the back seat. You had all this involvement, and the military is basically untouchable. And I think that was the piece I was trying to figure out. What makes this make sense? Like, why would you make this? Why would you risk all this? This blowback, especially if you saw what happened in the U.S. I mean, there was a ton of blowback that came from it. The Democrats have been running with this for years. So the only way that you would ever do this way, I guess, is if you either are completely deluded, like a lot of the people on the ground probably were, or you have that you have total impunity, which the only people that have that really is the military.
Well, I want to go back to this people on the ground were deluded point. I do think it's an important one. I saw a couple of left commentators talking about this on a stream recently. In the United States, there is this new church commission, this effort to investigate the weaponization of the security state. And predictably, liberals aren't a big fan. They think this is a way to basically destroy the Department of Justice or the FBI's ability to investigate Donald Trump and bring him to justice. Conservatives, I think, have a political interest in that being exactly the case. And then there's this other bigger ideological push that I think some other people believe in good faith, that these organizations have in fact been weaponized over the history of American history, that weaponization has often targeted the left. And it is a perfectly worthwhile goal to clean house at these organizations, even if you might not have an incredible amount of faith in the Republican Party's ability to do so well. And the conversation that I was listening to on the stream involved like the following scenario, the following question. Do we want a world where, looking back at the protests in 2020 around George Floyd, you have FBI agents scrutinizing cell phone footage of people standing in front of burning buildings, participating in George Floyd protests, and IDing them, following them to their homes, charging them with crimes in a way that can feel very politically motivated. Oh, you don't like what they were protesting? We can tie you to any number of things. Would we want that kind of behavior? As someone on the left who sympathized with the political goals there, I would say no. But how would we feel? I mean, is that what's basically in the works? Isn't that how some of the 1-6 protesters are behaving? And is that a fair comparison in the first place? Especially given that, to bring it back, especially given that so much of why people were out in the streets on 1-6 was because there was this real significant push from right-leaning corporate media figures and politicians to tell people that this was the way to go, including from the President of the United States himself, saying, don't, stand up and don't stand down, or whatever the heck language that he used to go forth and do exactly this. And I wonder, one, Andrew, what you make of the kind of parallels between how the media worked, how people were deluded on the ground, and what role social media in particular played in this. Because I remember back in 2018 when we were covering the Brazil elections, that WhatsApp and some of these alternative methods of communication were highly influential in Bolsonaro's successes.
Yeah, I mean, they were super successful this time around too. They just built up their operations, and they used public money to do it, and they also migrated a lot to Telegram because WhatsApp started cracking down the ability to spread messaging. So they're much bigger on Telegram now. And they built up their own separate media apparatus with some corporate and some independent media outlets. And they basically all work in lockstep, all coordinated by his son, Carlos Bolsonaro. And it makes it a lot easier than, that crazy, chaotic leftist media landscape, or even the corporate landscape where people are everyone's doing their own thing and looking at their own ways. They're all, towing the line, or they're completely cut off from the money and from the access. I think that for the part about the intelligence apparatus that you were talking about in the security state, the big thing here is that it's all run by the military. And that was one of the big reasons that the military got angry at Dilma, and this whole process started going on that ended in her impeachment, and then the election of Bolsonaro, was that she tried to remove the control of the intelligence apparatus, basically the Brazilian version of the CIA, and the intelligence council from a general controlling it to civilian command, and the military didn't want to be subordinated to the civilians. And she also was putting forward a thing to investigate a Truth and Reconciliation Committee to investigate the crimes of the military dictatorship. And so that's when the military started really, off-duty retired generals started colluding and coming together and building up their political force to prevent this so they would never face justice. And ironically, I mean, there's a lot of mistakes that happened in the Workers' Party era. And one of them is that in 2013, which is, in the middle of this Truth and Reconciliation process going on, and you already see the military starting to, form this countervailing force, there was these massive protests against, bus price increases, but also just a general discontent. And there was the, World Cup coming up, the Olympics. And so Dilma's government passed all these anti-terror laws, which basically increased the power for the military. And prior to that, the Lula government increased the military budget massively because he wanted to become an international player and have this international presence. After years and years of basically their budgets being desiccated, and they were much weaker. So Lula, strengthened them, and then Dilma gave all these new legal mechanisms, and then they got kicked out and it was put in power. So, but right now you have the situation where, like, even if you have, Lula in power, are they really controlling this intelligence apparatus? Is this going to be able to be used to help them, solve the coup plotting, or is it going to be used against them? Because there's always this fear here that's happened many times in the past of the military basically using all their surveillance equipment to find blackmail material against politicians and then use it against them.
Of course. And it was so, it was in significant part, reporting by Intercept Brazil that helped to expose those kind of corporate corruption plots and plots with the criminal justice system that ended up getting Lula imprisoned in the first place and getting him out of jail. And so I think it's very reasonable why people would be skeptical and very wary of the posture of the security state. I mean, I'll come back to you, Branko. It doesn't resolve, I think, some of the questions that I'm still having in the American context about how the left as a whole should be feeling about Republicans leading our own kind of Truth and Reconciliation Committee about what's been going on with our security state and some of the parallels that have been drawn between, 1/6 protesters and 2020 George Floyd protesters, and whether or not we should even be lumping them in the same breath, whether the treatment has to be consistent between the two, or if there's meaningful differences between the groups that warrant different kinds of treatment, whether the left should be invested in this new church committee project or not. And I wonder what you think of it all.
I mean, I think a new church committee is a good idea, but that is all going to depend on how it actually functions and what they're looking into. I mean, if the Republicans are only interested in sort of their particular hobby horses and not looking at things that The Intercept has reported on for years, things like the infiltration of law enforcement around the country by white supremacists, the targeting of Black Lives Matter protesters by the FBI, the surveillance powers around the press and journalists and all sorts of law-abiding activists. I mean, that's the stuff that I think is the most alarming. If the Republican leadership, if they end up targeting this and looking at not just kind of the January 6th protesters, but actually the full spectrum of protests that has been targeted and suppressed and surveilled in the United States over the past, few decades, then that would be good. That remains to be seen. But, I think this is the problem with the fact that this the cause of kind of checking the national security state has become just this exclusive Republican thing, just this conservative cause, when it really should be a liberal cause and certainly a left-wing cause. Now, I think most people on the left would see it that way. I don't think at this point as many liberals see it that way, that the FBI and the CIA and all these other security agencies need to be checked. And that gives room, or at least it sort of sets it up so that the only people who are going to be trying to look at some of these excesses are people on the right. And then by definition, you're probably not going to end up kind of checking what I think are the worst excesses of these national security agencies, which are I would say largely, to put it generously, targeted at the left. In terms of distinctions between different protests, I mean, this is why I have been talking about, we need to move away from this whole thing of demonizing people who basically were doing just an act of protest. Barging into the Capitol, that may not be very polite, but and occupying it. But that is has a long history on the left of protesters doing the same thing. Vietnam protesters did it. Of course, pro-union protesters up in Wisconsin did it. They occupied the Capitol there for a long time. So the act of going into a federal building and occupying it itself is not terrorism. It's not an insurrection. I think we have to be careful about that. And by the way, if you look at the report that was put out about the Lafayette Square, the Trump sending in military tear gassing them, putting it down. What those protesters were doing was not really that dissimilar from what the January 6th people were doing. They were throwing rocks. They injured police. They were pushing down barricades, trying to get through lines. So I think when we start to talk about that stuff, that's when we get into these. You can't really make much of a distinction legally. Really, the only distinction is really the ideology of the protesters. And obviously, I support the George Floyd protesters, but again, the protests, you're going to get some forms of excess. So I think that the better thing would be, I wish that liberals and people who support the Democratic Party were a little more awake to the dangers of the centralizing power and kind of giving more power to security agencies. I'll just say one more thing. One of the consequences of January 6th that was largely ignored. I tried to cover it here and there, but I'm just one person. There was an explosion of anti-protest bills across the United States in the wake of January 6th, much more than were introduced in the previous years. And in the case of, say, Florida, where DeSantis passed this really draconian, anti-riot bill. It's an anti-protest bill. It's to me, it's wildly unconstitutional. But there you go. When they passed it, they referenced January 6th as the reason that they needed to pass it. And later on, when they sort of promoted what they'd done, they had these videos where they intercut footage of the George Floyd protesters, whatever, damaging cars and doing, whatever, some sorts of vandalism with, January 6th rioters doing the same thing in the Capitol, basically trying to create this image of, things are out of control and we need law and order. And there's a lot of these bills that have been passed all over the place. There was an explosion of anti-terrorism prosecutions after George Floyd that were focused mostly on those protesters. The Capitol Police were sort of expanded into this national police force that is now meant to be doing kind of surveillance. And by the way, the Capitol Police cannot be FOIA'd, so that's a ripe for abuse right there. So there's a lot of things that have happened that I think people have not taken notice of. One more thing: Daniel Baker in Florida, in Tallahassee, he was an anarchist, a sort of left-wing anarchist, who was alarmed at the thought of that people were going to occupy the Capitol building in Florida after the events of January 6th. He put out flyers and put out Facebook posts, very hyperbolic and over the top. But saying that that he was willing to kind of resort to violence to stop what he thought was going to be a violent attack on the Capitol, and just for Facebook posts and flyers, he was put in jail on the same basis. They again, the people prosecuted and pointed to January 6th to say this is why we need to take this guy down. So it's a very worrying thing, I think, when we choose the wrong targets of what we need to actually change and check.
Yeah, I was struck. Again, I was watching, what's it called? This Place Rules, the Andrew Callahan documentary. And there was a little brief mention toward the end of one of the, Proud Boy, an anti-BLM protester. I'm not sure if they were actually affiliated with the Proud Boys or whatnot, but who had gotten a significant jail term. For taking a Black Lives Matter flag down from in front of that church at Lafayette Square and burning it. And it's just like a passing moment in the movie, but we're thinking, I don't think you should take Black Lives Matter flags down from churches and burn them, but like people are spending real jail time for burning an object in protest. Is that really the slippery slope that we want to go down? But I'm curious, Andrew, I mean, like you said earlier, that you know, Brazil has this more recent history of a coup actually being successful. Do you think that part of the way that we're talking about how, you know, there wasn't really an insurrection, it wasn't really the big deal, we should be more concerned about ramping up the security state than we should about something like this actually coming to fruition? Is that something that a way that Americans talk with the hubris of never having been in a situation where something like this worked?
I mean, I don't know. It's a complicated question. I think that there are two really different political situations in different contexts and also different constitutions, different legal systems here. And the big thing in Brazil is that there is a very clear article in the Constitution that says you can't be inciting a military coup because defensive. You can't be also antagonizing anti-democratic policies. Like democracy is a paramount virtue. And in Brazil, there's no absolute rights. Your rights only go so far as you're not impinging upon the rights of others. So when they went into the government buildings on January 8th, I don't think the real big issue is that they broke some chairs and some windows. It's that they did so because they thought that they were doing a military coup, and they were demanding the military demanding to be a provocation for the military to act, and that was the real crime that they committed.
I want to stay with that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Please.
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that I wanted to stay with that comparative law point for a second, because I do think that's at the root, as I understand it, of some of the criticisms that Glenn Greenwald has gotten recently in his criticism of what's been going on with Brazil from a speech perspective. Obviously, Glenn Greenwald has been very strong. I don't know if he uses the term free speech absolutist, but something close to that, a free speech advocate, former ACLU attorney, et cetera. And it's really interesting how that perspective, which is very popular in a moment in America right now, and has a lot of kind of like virtuous undertones behind it, looks different in other countries where you don't have that same kind of constitutional protection or expectation. And when there are competing values, like as you just said, Andrew, Drew, the idea that your rights are not absolute, they go up to where they impinge on somebody else's. Now, ostensibly, that's, I think, what we're supposed to have here, I guess. We don't have an absolute right to do a lot of things, but I take your point. I mean, the right to own a gun is largely protected outside of certain, I don't know, a criminal record and mental incompetency or some other kinds of things. But generally speaking, I would like to think that the ethos, the whole point is that there is a balancing act, and the restrictions that exist on speech and everything else are done in recognition of the fact that we also have those boundaries. But obviously it's different. It's a different feeling and it's a different expectation for what's happening in Brazil. So I wonder, how do you understand these criticisms, Andrew? I understand them as people, as kind of Glenn importing his American speech sensibilities onto Brazil, which is, fine. He's obviously allowed to have his orientation. I'm closer, obviously, to an American orientation. It's also the air that I breathe and the world that I grew up in. But in a Brazilian context, does it seem inappropriate? Does it seem like a critique of someone's kind of value for speech as opposed to just their adherence to a different legal standard? I mean, how are you reading all of this?
In a Brazilian legal context, it makes no sense. It's if that's your belief system and you'd like for the Brazilian legal context to change, that's one thing, and everyone has the right to have that opinion. But in the Brazilian legal context, racism is illegal because that's impinging upon the rights of other people to live their lives without being the victims of racism. Homophobia is made illegal for the same concepts. You can't defend Nazis because Brazil was the second biggest Nazi party in the world after Germany in the 30s, and they have this very dark and terrible history. So it's just a completely different legal system and legal culture. And I think generally speaking, the people who adhere to that more absolutist point of view tend to be more right-leaning neoliberal types in Brazil who idolize the United States and the free markets and all of the propaganda that we've been fed growing up in the United States. In Brazil, I think there's a much more acceptance that there's free speech is not absolute, and also that the need for defending democracy in the face of a military coup movement is much more important than someone's right to be able to tweet, and that seems to be the crux of the disagreement there.
So is the criticism that Glenn is making basically that Lula, just like basically anybody in Brazil, is following legal standards with respect to speech that are more, I don't know, conservative isn't necessarily the right word, but less expansive, less absolute than what we expect in the United States, and that him then using words like moderate or conservative or whatever that was to describe Lula is being interpreted as a criticism of Lula when it should be, and maybe it should be targeted more as a criticism of Brazil's legal standards from the perspective of an American free speech absolutist?
So to be clear, I mean, Lula's not doing this at the Supreme Court. He's not. He hasn't been making these requests. They've been doing them independently, and that's part of the criticisms of the Supreme Court, that they're overstepping their bounds because they're not waiting for the Attorney General to make a request, for example, because the Attorney General is this hardcore Bolsonaro supporter who's basically been taking every complaint against him and putting it in the drawer and closing the drawer. So he's been basically derelict of his duties. And so the Supreme Court's been taking a more proactive stance, which is legally questionable in the Brazilian legal context. But obviously the PT has been supporting it. But, Lula was elected with a center-right vice president. The coalition that got him elected this time around it's basically everybody else. It's the Bolsonaristas and the military and the extreme right and everybody else that voted for Lula or chose not to vote. So I think it's sort of a cherry picking to say that, this is all Lula. The left is, because in Brazil, especially in like the mainstream media, they love to talk about how the left fascism or left authoritarianism, because Lula's friends with Maduro and he's friends with Cuba, and look at him hanging out with Evo Morales and yada yada. So it's an old trope amongst the right reactionary set in Brazil, and I think by stoking that claim, and also I've seen a lot of people making this saying Lula and this is doing this when really it's the Supreme Court, is really just provoking this and legitimizing the Bolsonaro and the coup plotting point of view.
The idea that the conservatives, the right wing, is more free than the left wing, because the left wing, at least under a left wing president, the Supreme Court is enforcing its national speech standards. Which
in Brazil,
Exactly.
In Brazil, the reference point for censorship is having a colonel sitting in the newsroom saying what can and cannot be published, and journalists being called into the secret police office for questioning and then never coming out and being hung in their cell. That's what the military dictatorship was. That's what these people want. I mean, they want people like me and people like my friends and my colleagues to not be able to publish the truth about anything that they find disagreeable, and to have complete impunity to kill us and other people who defend democracy or a different point of view. And so that's what freedom of speech is in Brazil. That's the point of reference. So, I mean, people not being able to tweet their open calls to have a military coup, I mean, that doesn't really, it's in the Brazilian legal context, that right does not supersede everybody else's rights to not live under a tyranny.
And how long have you lived in Brazil?
10 years.
Okay. And you're American, right?
Yep.
And Branko, you're from New Zealand?
I'm from New Zealand.
What's the speechy deal in New Zealand? What's the free speech standards?
Oh, New Zealand has more restrictive standards than the United States. I mean, the United States is actually pretty unique in the world for how permissive it is. But I mean, I think that also means that New Zealand, for instance, we had someone who was not that long ago prosecuted for sedition for something he published in a magazine. There's all sorts of In the UK, for instance, which has a similar legal system, the government is able to apply prior restraint, which to prevent something that's that they object to on national security grounds, but of course that's a very flexible standard. And they can say, well, actually, no, sorry, newspaper people, you can't publish that. And that's what they actually did when a newspaper was going to publish something in the 2000s, I believe a memo that was showing discussions about bombing a news agency in Iraq by the US-led coalition. And Blair stepped in and said, no, you can't publish that. National security grounds, but of course it would have been highly embarrassing for him in the UK. Look, I'm not American. I don't approach this stuff from a legalistic standpoint. For me, I look at the history of how powers that, were initially aimed at the right, repressive powers that had good intentions, were ultimately used later on against the left. And that's the way I approach this stuff. So, I have two kind of standards that I think of is, number one, what are the dangers here? Are the dangers sufficient enough that they warrant rethinking a certain course of action? And then number two, is it going to be effective? And in this case, I'm just going to talk about the US context, but the push to respond to January 6th and other similar, let's say misinformation crises through social media censorship. Let's just take the second one. Is it going to work? I don't think so. I mean, the Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center put out this report. They put out several reports about misinformation, but they put out one about election misinformation in advance of 2020. And what they said was, this is a overwhelmingly an elite and mass media driven phenomenon. As in, people weren't getting this stuff off Twitter and Facebook. I mean, of course, it's you can find that stuff on there, and of course, people were seeing it. But by and large, people were getting it because they were hearing it from political elites like Trump and other Republicans, and they were hearing it from, cable news outlets, conservative news outlets. So, I mean, if you really, if you want to take a kind of information suppression approach to this, what you really have to do is, social media isn't going to change that. You would have to really start to heavily censor the news media. In ways that would be across the First Amendment, in pretty egregious ways. And I don't think anyone's actually going to suggest that. So to me, all of this stuff is not really going to work. But at the same time, I mean, if we look at the history of all this social media, content moderation, that's the euphemism that has become popular since 2016. It's been devastating for independent and left-wing media. Google's algorithm change early on led to massive traffic drops to a number of left-wing publications. I published a piece. I talked to a bunch of left-wing YouTube creators, including Crystal Ball, who used to be on Rising, and they talked about how how capricious and arbitrary and nonsensical YouTube's content moderation policies are, the way they censor stuff that they shouldn't be censoring because either the algorithm gets things wrong or sometimes because there's an explicitly political bias at play and they want to suppress certain kinds of reporting. And I think the last thing I would say is, I'm always trying to get people to go to the root causes of why things happen instead of kind of going for like a very kind of crudely reactive response to things. So, I mean, you look at the actual people who are involved in the Capitol riot. We've had several, two different studies at least, of some of those people who are arrested. And sure, of course, there were ultra rich people in there and sort of upper middle class people and the kind of people that you expect from a Trump base. But a lot of them, I think actually more than half, in the kind of one study, had histories of financial troubles, bankruptcies, debt, foreclosures, so on and so forth. So to me, the question is always, misinformation is not new. Misinformation has been around since the dawn of time. Why is it now that people are more susceptible to believing in it, to having faith in it? Why are people more likely now to listen to someone like Joe Rogan who tells you outright, I have no idea what I'm talking about. I'm not an expert. Don't listen to me. And people go, well, I kind of trust him more in the vaccine than I do a doctor or a government official. And I think it's part of this long-running crisis of democracy in the United States and elsewhere, where the deterioration of economic conditions and the government's inability or refusal to do anything about it, I think has just led to a collapse of faith and trust in government and institutions. And that's the thing that's really going to solve this. And unfortunately, that doesn't have an easy, you pass a law and that's it. That's a much harder project. But I wish that we talked about that a little more in the U.S. discourse and kind of Western discourse more generally as well.
Rocco,
Same thing here.
What I'm finding so provocative about this, Robbie and I were talking about this on Rising a little bit this morning. The fact that my radar, I covered all of these kind of anti-trans bills that are restrictions on a person's ability to dress in drag, which implicates a lot of people who are not trans. Like, am I allowed to dress up as Peter Pan for Halloween, or is that drag? These laws that criminalize parents who allow their kids to do gender transition. This law that says you got to put your ID in if you want to watch porn in Louisiana. Your state ID, like all of this stuff that's like very clearly anti-freedom, restrictions on your ability to live your life, things that in the abstract Republicans should be mad at. But of course, because of cultural valences and anti-trans rhetoric and all of this stuff, there's no real collective outrage. And I was trying to spotlight that fact. And Robbie and I were having this conversation about what to do about speech and Twitter and censorship and Clint Klippenstein and his article about the Tesla getting in a crash, being suppressed on Twitter. And, all of this, it's everything. It's everything and everywhere and all at once. And it seems like part of the problem of working it out is because it feels like we're fighting with one hand tied behind our back, sometimes with the First Amendment. And you said by your own metric there, Bronco, that, by prong one, it's not going to, these speech restrictions on social media aren't really going to work because to go as far as they would need to go, you would run into First Amendment problems. But isn't that kind of what we're talking about here? It's a very taboo subject in the United States, but are we getting our money's worth out of the First Amendment?
Oh, I mean,
and from Andrew, your perspective, you grew up in good old USA, you moved to Brazil. It's a different historical context, cultural context, political context. Are you like over the First Amendment? Do you feel like you're over it for Brazil, but not for the United States? I mean, is that a crazy question?
No, it's not a crazy question. It's hard to answer, though. I mean, just because there's a law in the United States doesn't mean that I agree with all the laws in the United States. And just because the laws are the way they are here doesn't mean I have to agree with them. But there are definitely separate situations. But I mean, I have a lot of problems with the press freedom in Brazil. I run a news organization and we get a lot of lawsuits, spurious lawsuits, that we have to spend a lot of money and time on. And sometimes because of how the judicial system is, we lost the first case that we ever lost. They didn't prove that we said anything wrong. In the United States, the case for libel, you have to have proof of malice. Here, you just need to have said something wrong. In this case, they didn't even prove that we said something wrong, but there was a previous case where another outlet had did a different article years before where they had written about this issue and they were convicted. And so the judge said, we're going to follow the precedent and we're going to convict them, even though they couldn't prove anything that we did wrong. And that was in this appeals court. I mean, that's insane.
Yeah.
And that's how things are here. And there's been Supreme Court decisions against journalists that basically the journalist did a book about a Supreme Court justice. He didn't like it. And he ended up getting this massive ruling. And any subsequent printings of the book needed to have basically the judge wrote 60 pages of the book that they needed to include the ruling from that case in this. Basically, he killed the book. He killed the book and he got paid a bunch of money to do so. And it's completely outrageous. I mean, the way that things here aren't perfect either. And generally, I think in the U.S., even though people who defend the First Amendment say that it's because it will always be used to attack the weakest among us, but at least how it works here very often, the concept of free speech is that there's only free speech for people who are rich. I mean, there's free speech, you can say whatever you want, but then you can be sued and lose a lot of money, or you be forced to pay a lot of money, or you have to have the money to be able to sue somebody to protect your honor. And so for 99% of the population here, maybe 99.5%, they don't have the money to do either of those things. So they don't actually have free speech, and they live under a regime of self-censorship. So I wish that there was more freedom to be able to speak the way that you do in a podcast in the United States, that we can't do that in Brazil. We have to be more restrictive and careful about who we're offending, even if we're speaking the truth. And that's a huge problem. But I think in the end, in the U.S., it's the same way that the the ability to be able to fully take advantage of free speech is something that's only available to the richest amongst us, and that's
I hear that
an issue of the judicial system.
But also, when you say something like you're not allowed to encourage a coup, like I completely understand why that makes sense, even in an American context. I mean, I'm sitting there watching 1/6. I'm not exactly feeling like safe and happy and secure, even though ideologically, you know, I have some sympathy for that kind of civil protest. However, you know, you're talking about the real threats that you and your colleagues are under, how difficult it is for you to report. I'm thinking back to the case of the threats against Glenn and his family and the home invasion, and all of this stuff has happened. That's so serious. It's so serious, especially as compared to the kind of things we tend to complain about, doxing or whatever in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But you're not allowed to call for a coup. I mean, I can think of a million instances where I would be on the side of the people calling for a coup historically and thinking, oh my God, like if I root for a third party in the United States, am I calling for a coup? If I tweet, don't vote for Joe Biden and let's go into the streets, am I calling for a coup?
No.
You know,
I could imagine some crazy right-wing judge maybe making that case somewhere down the road. And I understand that it's a slippery slope argument.
Yeah.
But the answer to that is no.
And you say that confidently, despite having just described all of the legal quagmires that you and the Intercept Brazil have been in.
I think that maybe one of the biggest differences, and you know, maybe I'm not right on this, but I feel that one of the biggest differences that I found in Brazilian political analysis and U.S. political analysis is that there's a lot more faith in the systems and the impartiality of those systems in the United States. Despite everything that's happened to Stephen Donziger, despite looking at what the current U.S. Supreme Court is, I mean, it's very obvious to an outside observer that the U.S. Supreme Court and the U.S. judicial system is extremely, extremely politicized. And it's done so in a way that privileges corporate power and, you know, the status quo ruling elite. That's not a surprise to anybody in Brazil. I mean, maybe in more elite circles where people like to talk about the concepts and the principles, there's more of this belief in the rule of law. But I mean, if you're most people in Brazil, you live under a military dictatorship already. I mean, if you're going in and out of a favela in Rio every single day, you're getting stop and frisked, and you're getting, you know someone who's gotten drugs planted on them. You know someone who got murdered by the cops in a shakedown and they planted a gun. I mean, that sort of stuff happens every single day, and there's complete impunity. In Rio, I think the rate of convictions for cops who, you know, have been accused of that sort of crime is 0.004. Maybe I skipped a numeral there, but I mean, that's just the way it is here. People understand that, and I think that's the way it is in the whole world. I'm not saying it's just a Brazilian concept, you know.
Yes, I mean, I think
people are more realistic about it.
That's what's so difficult, because things being lawless and horrible everywhere, and power corrupting, and inequity being what it is. Are we just clinging to the First Amendment like a baby blanket? Like, we know it's bad.
Hold on. Okay.
Okay, come on, get in here, Bronco.
The First Amendment is not what... This is exactly what I was talking about. The First Amendment is not why this is happening. There are root issues, root causes to this that have their roots in the mass disillusionment in democracy. That is a problem of political economy. It's the First Amendment. You may as well say that the reason, and many people did after 2016, but the reason this is all happening is because too many people have the right to vote.
Not that the First Amendment is why this is happening, Bronco.
Yeah.
But the First Amendment isn't enough to keep these injustices
of course it's
from happening,
not enough.
and that we're kind of pretending it's doing more than it's doing. Of course
it's not. No. The First Amendment is not the solution. We're talking about the kind of sentiment towards kind of curtailing or saying, well, you know what, actually we should have a narrower definition of it. That is not going to do anything. That's what I'm arguing against. The First Amendment is actually very important in the same way that, look, you could... If you wanted to, you could try and solve a lot of problems by simply limiting a bunch of people's right to vote. You could say, well, you know what? No right is absolute. A lot of people have voting rights who have said or done terrible things in the past. You know, for the sake of protecting democracy, for the sake of protecting stability and the republic, all of that, let's make it so people can't vote. Now,
But that's what you do in the United States already, even with the First
Well,
Amendment,
of course.
right?
But when
I mean,
but
how
when
many people
if
are
I
disenfranchised
advocate,
in the US?
of course. But if I advocate for that, that is immediately repugnant. It's not a thing that we support. It's a thing that we say, well, no, that's appalling. We would never do that. And that's incredibly dangerous to empower the government or political actors to decide who is it that has the right to vote and who doesn't. So for that reason, I mean, it's a bad idea to suddenly say, oh, we should just get rid of the First Amendment. Because again, not only does it have incredible dangers, but also you're not going to solve the fundamental issues why this is happening. I mean, countries that have far more restricted speech, by the way, than the United States are also going through very much the same political crises, which should tell you that you know, the someone's ability to speak or not is not really the thing that is driving what's happening in the world right now.
Okay, but Bronco, New Zealand seems pretty good.
No, not really. No, New Zealand had a huge, a very weeks-long anti-vaccine protest that got very ugly. I mean, they occupied the grounds outside of Parliament. It was a very tricky situation.
But what was the problem? Doesn't New Zealand have like almost like zero COVID, right? Because they could do the whole
not
island
anymore.
thing.
No. New Zealand got up on zero COVID a while ago. New Zealand's been going through a huge explosion of cases for a while. No, New Zealand, you know, is going through the same exact problems. And again, New Zealand is a country where inequality has been ballooning. It's a country where poverty has been exploding, particularly over the course of the pandemic. A lot of these people that have been, you know, either deluded by anti-vaccine misinformation and conspiracy theories, or were resentful about vaccine mandates that led them to lose their jobs, they were working class people. And so again, New Zealand is suffering the exact same conditions of this deteriorating political economy that I'm talking about and everything else.
But I guess the point I'm making is what role is the First Amendment or lack thereof playing in New Zealand? It's not, again, this isn't a case for the First Amendment being the cause of anybody's problems, but it does, again, like when I'm talking to Robbie on the show and we're saying, well, we agree that something is a harm, like we agree that some outcome is bad, but we respect the First Amendment rights. So we just kind of got to let it. For example, I saw a trans activist tweeting today about they've projected you know how you can project like symbols and light things onto buildings at night? People do this in protests all the time. They will just project the image into the building. Someone had projected like a swastika and a cross intertwined on a building. And it's like, what can you do about it? They're on public property. They're shining a light. Like, what are you going to do? And especially in America, what are you going to do? You can't do anything. And in America, we often sit with these kind of uncomfortable things. Oh, well, the Nazis are going to protest. Oh, well, there's a swastika on the building. Oh, well, Kanye and Alex Jones should maybe have the right to still be on Twitter as a matter of principle. And does that keep us getting to the bigger moral issue? Like, how should we design our society? What kind of behavior should we encourage? We're having all of these righteous battles over what does or does not qualify for protection under the First Amendment. And does that kind of sidestep a different kind of conversation about what kind of society we want to be? Separate and apart from how we impose that, but just who do we want to be in the first place? You know,
that's a worthy conversation to have. But again, you know, I'll call attention to the fact that the primary reason to be concerned, or at least to have some caution when embarking on these measures, is because they can be used by, you know, in democracies, power changes hands. And even when it doesn't, I mean, the people who have inordinate influence and power in society are able to have access to these powers much more than ordinary people. And so they're much more, you know, they're going to be able to take the recent Twitter files disclosure, right? That one of the things that Lee Fang at The Intercept just reported on was how pharma executives were trying to push Twitter to censor not anti-vaccine conspiracy mongers, but people who were part of a campaign on social media during COVID when you couldn't go outside and gather in mass rallies, who were saying, let's create a generic vaccine that's cheaper so that everyone in the world can access it. Now, these pharma executives found that a threat to their profits, obviously, as evidenced by the fact that, you know, they've gone above and beyond, even well beyond this, to block that from happening. And they said, well, hold on, why don't we just get Twitter to try and just censor these people and you know, we can call them misinformation spreaders and so on and so forth. That's what's going to happen 9 times out of 10 in the kind of society that we live in. So the you know, again, I don't think that clamping down on social media and speech online is really going to solve these crises. But what it will do is allow a variety of powerful actors to silence dissenting voices. which tends to happen. I mean, I can give you a million reasons. I mean, you asked, what is the use of the First Amendment? For one, so that Richard Nixon couldn't block the release of the Pentagon Papers. So that, when Edward Snowden revealed, the vastness of the surveillance state and just how pervasive it was in US society and throughout the world, the US and the UK governments and the other Five Eyes powers weren't able to step in and say, no, you can't publish that. The people must not hear about this. I mean, that is the reason for the First Amendment. I think talking about the First Amendment and free speech is a distraction from, again, the deeper seated issues that are really causing the problems that we're living through right now.
Andrew,
and
are you persuaded? Yeah, go ahead.
Just because this is a theoretical conversation about the First Amendment, freedom of speech in a general context, but in the context of what happened in January in Brazil, there was judicial orders to stop people from orchestrating a coup or supporting a coup that is very real and possibly could still even happen. We're not really sure what's going on. And that judge is doing so on the grounds that he is essentially protecting people's freedom to assemble, freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom to live under a democratic regime, because he's preventing a far-right government. The first thing they were going to do would be to clamp down with a censorship regime. And as I was saying before, how people in Brazil maybe have a more realistic understanding of how, law is political, it's fluid, it's not these absolutes that are handed down from God in practice. I think the reason why there's this mass consensus that's much larger than just the PT, the general consensus that what the judge did was correct, and against what was this other point of view that of more free speech absolutism, is because they understand that if he did not do this, and it's become, I wasn't so sure about this previously, but as time has gone on, it's become increasingly clear to me that it seems to me that if this judge did not act in the way that he did, I'm really not sure that we would be in the position where we are right now in Brazil. Like,
how do you mean?
He did so many things.
You're not sure that Lula would be president? You're not sure that there wouldn't have been a coup?
This judge has been working over, for years now, basically being the one handbrake to the Bolsonaro stampede, because they bought off the Congress, they got the military on their side. They, for a few years at least, they had the press on their side. They have the attorney general on their team. They had infiltration of all of the security and intelligence apparatus. Like, they really had this control of all of the levers of power. The only real check on Bolsonaro's power has been the Supreme Court. And they basically had to step up because of the other branches of government not doing their job, which is also a crime in Brazil. I can't think of the word in English right now, but it's when you have a duty and you're not doing it. That's a crime. It's prevarication in Portuguese. I don't know if that's the word. Yeah, dereliction of duty. Thank you. Which you can, lose your office and be arrested for. And so they basically said, well, everyone else is derelict in duty, and this is getting really scary. And so they stepped in to make. And it seemed that he had a lot of inside information that maybe we still don't have, or that we didn't have at the time, and was making these specific moves to block certain actions. Like there was a document that came out because of the raid on the security minister's house. That was the order of the coup. Like, we have that written. You can find it on Twitter right now, and I'm sure it's been translated into English. That basically said, we're going to establish this commission to reevaluate the election results because it was a fraud, and we're going to have this panel that's going to be embodied to reevaluate the results. 9 members from the military, 2 from the police, 3 from the Congress, whatever. The military was going to have the majority. And right around that same time, and Bolsonaro's party the president of his party was like the main articulator in the political sphere of trying to get support for this. This judge put an order on his party, fining them 22 million reais, which is like $4.5 million, and blocked their access to all of their bank accounts. And that apparently, from the reporting, and still, I'm not sure if it's entirely true, that's what freaked them out and made them stop, jump off the bandwagon.
I guess the question I have, Andrew, is are there other methodologies that would have stopped the coup ball from rolling, even if there were a similar kind of First Amendment paradigm in place in Brazil? Is it in fact an all or nothing? Is the fact that certain kinds of restrictions on speech were part of the counter coup effort, does that mean that those restrictions were necessary for a counter coup effort? And what does it mean that there was a military coup in Brazil despite there never having been a First Amendment? And maybe I'll put it this way. Would you import that same kind of standard to the United States? Do you think that the First Amendment is doing more harm than good here?
I've been living in Brazil for far too long to answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, Bronco, I think I'm hearing you, and I agree. I can agree with how things have worked out because I'm sympathetic to Lula. I don't like Bolsonaro. You know what I mean? Like everything is working out for me in this way. But you can imagine a situation where the roles were flipped, and Bolsonaro is using his ability to stop bank accounts and limit political discussion on the internet to advance his own interests. Does that concern you?
You mean in Brazil or?
Yeah, in Brazil. I mean, I'm saying to Andrew, like those tools are able to work in Lula's favor right now, but they could easily be deployed by any number of people. No, isn't that kind of the point that Bronco's making?
Well, let me just also quickly say, I mean, we've talked about the fact that the fundamental problem in Brazil is the fact that the military is not really ever completely relinquished power or the impulse to sort of take it back. I mean, I don't know how much social media censorship is going to help with that, but you know, I mean,
yeah, is it a fig leaf? Is it like a weird stalking horse in this conversation? This is what I'm saying. Like, it's not that I'm trying to get us to say like First Amendment is good or bad, but are we all just kind of projecting stuff onto speech rights? And Americans believing that speech rights are protecting us more than they actually are. Brazilians perhaps believing that the ability to restrict certain kinds of speech in the media is protecting them more than it actually is.
I mean, look, I'll just say for me, in the US context, I mean, I think the First Amendment is just the thin thread that is like one of the last things hanging, stopping everything from going into full authoritarianism. I mean, there's the discussion about the First Amendment as some sort of threat is bizarre to me when you have the biggest threat is this massive, unaccountable, opaque national security state that just works in the shadows. That is almost a secret government of its own. That is a far bigger threat to democracy. And by the way, we know has played a role in you know, they work with the far right as informants. They sometimes even have manufactured far right violence. You know, as in the case of the Gretchen Whitmer with the kidnapping case. You know, I mean that stuff to me is a far bigger threat. The First Amendment kind of in this discussion to me is kind of I don't know. It's a distraction, I think.
I kind of agree.
Yeah.
I agree as someone who kind of frames
that's sort of the argument here.
close. Yeah, that's kind of fascinating. I appreciate both of you for helping me work through this a little bit because I was feeling this tension this morning when we were recording on Rising. And I'm someone who, in a very American way, very much values the First Amendment, has always seen it as a kind of you know, a line in the sand against which you can measure other people, point out hypocrisy, force people because there's been so much kind of conservative cultural investment in the idea of the First Amendment at this moment in history. It's a cudgel you can use in the way I did on my radar today to force people to say, well, then if you want your rights, you got to give trans people rights too, you know, and it's useful to me. And that's part of why I think I cling to it. I do cling to it, but I'm also sensitive to some of the things that you've been saying, Andrew, about how context dependent it is and how easy it is, frankly, for I think some of us here on the left in the United States to kind of cosplay support for 1/6 or different kinds of armed revolutions when we've never really been in the mix. And that's not to say that that's wrong. I do think that there's going to come a time when shit's going to go down. I won't say anything more than that. And that's it's going to be necessary because we're going to be pushed. The people are going to be pushed. There's going to be an end to all of this. But, you know, I do think there's a way that we can talk about it in a way that's a little bit unserious and not really plot out how it's going to go down, and be really realistic about the potential of it not incurring to our benefit, frankly, and whether or not we would want different rules in place in case of that eventuality. So anyway, thank you.
In Brazil, it's not a free speech issue. That's people are considering this just a big distraction. I mean, it's a preventing coup issue, and it seems pretty obvious to most of the people that like you got to do what you got to do to preserve your democracy, and you'll do whatever it takes.
Andrew, how did the military coup end in the 80s? The military government.
It was a negotiated settlement, so that's why they never really relinquished power. They never faced any sort of prosecution or justice. So they, quote unquote, benevolently relinquished power to a democratic regime, and there was a transition period, and they sort of sat in the back seat for a while, but were able to defend all their privileges and all their rights. And they have a lot of privileges. And then it was only in the past, since 2008, 2010, basically, that they've basically decided that they wanted to come back and become this strong, much more active political force. But before they were just sort of this untouchable behind the scenes. They even have their own courts and military justice. So you can't prosecute them in a civil court.
So Andrew, is there an argument that there should have been a revolution, a violent uprising that would have actually set things straight permanently? Don't answer that. I don't want you to get in trouble and know that you can't say that in Brazil.
Can I just add one more thing? The other threat to democracy, I think this applies to Brazil as well, as corporate control and the control of the super rich over the political process. I mean, that's the other thing. I think that's another fundamental cause of January 6th. Again, it's the result of years of policy that deregulated the news media and the media in general in the US and allowed the proliferation of these, money influenced cable news channels that kind of poison people. But also it's people giving money to all the people who are kind of spreading misinformation in Congress and so on and so forth. And I know Brazil is investigating some of the agribusiness sector that may have been financing some of this stuff. So, I think that's where I'm not a free speech absolutist. I mean, I do think money is speech, and I think money should be very, very strictly regulated. Absolutely.
I think that's right. And you make that point very strongly in your piece, which people can find at Jacobin, and they should also check out your book, Yesterday's Man, Branko. I forgot to introduce that in the beginning. I appreciate you both. Tell the people where they can find you more broadly.
Sure. You can find me on jacobin.com. You can find me in these Times. I write for them sometimes. I have a podcast called 1of200.nz. It's about New Zealand. And on Twitter, I guess, at bmarchitich.
Wonderful. And you, Andrew, where can people find you and your work in the world?
So I work for The Intercept Brazil, which is since October, we're an independent organization, independent from the Intercept in the US. Right now, our website is theintercept.com/Brazil, but we'll have a new website soon. And, we're an independent news organization that's basically almost entirely user funded right now. So if you want to support us, you can go to theintercept.com/Brazil and become a donor. Everything's in Portuguese, but you can translate it or you can email me, and it's easy. I'm on Andrew D. Fish on Twitter. I'll be happy to help you with your Portuguese. And I have some articles that I wrote last year on the Intercept's website in English too.
Okay, terrific. Thank you to you both. This has been a wonderful thought experiment. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you to all of our listeners. You know that if you want to listen to the Glenn episode that I've referenced and a zillion other premium episodes, you can subscribe at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month. If you just want to see one episode or binge for a day, you can subscribe and then unsubscribe, and it'll just be $5. And you're not locked into anything long-term. Appreciate all your support as of late. And if you're not ready to become a subscriber, do remember that we put full videos of all of our Thursday episodes and partial extended clips of the premium Monday episodes up over on Bad Faith YouTube. It's good, high quality video content, and it helps support independent media and helps us beat the algorithm. If you subscribe to that channel, click the notification bell and click the videos when you like them over there. So thanks again for listening. And as always, keep the faith. Hey, YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.